So welcome everyone to this PLSA Policy Insights webinar on the regulatory horizon for 2024. I'm James Walsh. I'm the Head of Membership Engagement here at the PLSA. And for those of you who perhaps haven't dialed into one of these before, the purpose of these webinars is very much about giving you an insight into the policy work the PLSA does, and also helping you, our members, to know what's coming down the track so you can prepare in your schemes. We've got over 300 people, 310 people registered for this one. So I guess that just shows how much there is to prepare for over the next year. I'm joined this morning by three of my colleagues. We're going to be hearing from our Director of Policy and Advocacy, Nigel Peaple. Nigel, good morning to you.
Hi, James.
Nice to have you with us. And also we've got Joe Dabrowski, our Deputy Director of Policy. Morning, Joe.
Morning, James, and morning, everyone.
Thank you. And also we've got Katy Little, who is our Parliamentary and Stakeholder Manager. Hi there, Katy.
Morning, James. Morning, everyone.
Great to have you all with us. So the plan for this session is I'm going to talk to Nigel for a few minutes, just about how the PLSA goes about putting its policies together, you know, who sits on our various committees and so on, how we structure that. Then we've got Joe to talk about what we are expecting next year. He's got a slide with a very long list of things, and he's going to pick a few items out of those. We'll have a few questions as well to Joe at that point. And then we're going to go back to Nigel to hear about the priorities that we and our policy board, who met yesterday, have set our policy work over the next year. Nigel will talk us through that and take some more of your questions. So do be ready at all times with your questions. You can put them in the Q&A box. And then we'll finish with Katy talking us through a bit of a political situation, what we do to liaise with the political parties and influence their manifestos. I guess we could talk about that all day, Katy, but we haven't got all day. And a few more questions and answers at the end. So I do want to get plenty of your input in from the audience. Put those questions into the Q&A box, please. So Nigel, we're going to kick off with you. And it's a great time to have this conversation because our policy board did meet just yesterday, I believe. Maybe you can give us a guide, Nigel. I know you've got a slide on this about who sits on the policy board and a bit about what its role is.
Yeah, okay. So basically, we do a mixture of proactive and reactive work on our policy and advocacy here at the PLSA. And the policy board sets an annual work program on the basis of something that we've worked out within the team, which takes into account everything that's going on out there and all the things our members have said they want us to achieve. And in particular, our overarching objective that everyone in the UK should have an adequate income in retirement. Now, the policy board has 20 people on it, and a majority of those are from our pension fund members. And we make sure there's representation there from DB schemes, single employer trust DC, master trusts, and members of the local government pension scheme. And then in addition, there's a few more places where we have some of the people that are the advisors to pension schemes. So for instance, the lawyers, fund managers, EBC, professional trustee. So we try to have it like a kind of brains trust of the industry. And our policy board at the moment is chaired by John Chilman, who's the CEO of Railpen.
I beg your pardon. We've got our 4 policy committees as well, Nigel. Perhaps you can talk us through how those operate.
Yeah, indeed. Okay, so indeed, there are 4 policy committees, as you said, and you might be able to guess. There's one for DB, there's one for DC, there's one for the Master Trust, and there's one for the local government pension scheme. I should add, there are also 4 advisory groups, legal advisory group, stewardship advisory group, a DB multi-employer schemes, and an asset owners advisory group. And to be honest, we also have a bunch of other working groups on specific topics and issues as they come up in the year. I should just mention, because your lovely slide that you've put together, the chairs of our policy committees there. So as I mentioned, John Chilman's up there in the top left, chair of policy board. And then Laura Myers, chair of DC committee, Laura from LCP. She's actually just stood down as she's now joined our PLSA board, and will soon be announcing our new chair of that committee. And then you see to her right, I think, there's Zoe Alexander from Nesh, she chairs the Master Trust Committee. Below that is Neil Mason from Surrey County Council for the LA Committee. And then there's Rob Orr at the bottom there from the Saul Pension Scheme, who chairs our DB Committee. So there are 4 policy committees, and they basically drill down into the specific topic areas. I suppose it's important to say that, generally speaking, our lines are agreed and signed off by the policy board, but on some occasions, they delegate that to the sort of specialist committees.
Yeah. Thanks, Nigel. And you've got quite a team as well in the policy side of things here at the PLSA. You know, how have you got that structured? How does it fit together?
Yeah, so we've got about 20 people who work on policy and advocacy, and about half of those are policy staff, as we call them. And then we have about another half that deal with media relations, public affairs, Parliament, etc., and research, plus a little bit of management support as well. So we kind of split our work like that.
Yeah, that's great. And I think you've got some of those characters featured on the slide there, Nigel, yourself and Joe seems to be gesturing at some sort of conference we've got in there. We're going to be hearing from Joe. Well, then perhaps just introduce Tiffany and Alicia and their roles. We've got them featured on the slide as well.
So thanks, James. So Tiffany's in charge of our work on DB issues and the local government pension scheme, and has a kind of cross-cutting brief on investment. And Tiffany is in charge of, as we say, all the DC issues, master trust issues, and as and when they come up, lifetime savings issues. Brilliant. Tiffany and Alicia report into Joe.
Yep. And Nigel, of course, as you know, as a head of membership, I'm always looking to make sure the members get every opportunity to get involved in our work. You know, what's the best way for members who want to sort of contribute to our policy work to put their input in?
Okay, well, I suppose there's 2 key ways, James. So the first is that, each year we sort of advertise and say when places come up on policy board and the policy committees. There's between 80 and 100 places on the policy board and policy committees, and we make sure that there's a gradual turnover so more members can get involved over time. And so we normally sort of advertise for that about June-ish. We had 4 new members of the policy board joining yesterday, for example. So you can volunteer. There is quite a rigorous selection procedure, and we're lucky that actually lots of members are really keen to get involved. So then we have to take quite a lot of time thinking about have we got the balance of membership right, who's got the right skills and things. Generally, everybody's more than capable of doing it, but it's just a question of getting the balance right. And then the other key way actually is responding to some of our member surveys, because when we do our policy work, basically something will come out. We might get a steer from a committee. We've got a pretty good idea of the kind of things that matter to our members because, we've been doing this for some time. But we'll also very often do a member survey to test out specific points. So if people respond to member surveys, that's a great way to feed into our policy work. And we now have the practice of anyone who fills out a survey gets to see all the results as well, which normally members find quite interesting.
Brilliant. Thanks, Nigel. That's really helpful to understand sort of how we go about the policy work, and we're going to come back to you in a few minutes' time. But I'm going to turn over to Joe now to talk us through the pretty long list of what we're expecting from the government and the regulators next year. Joe, shall we start sort of at the top with the Treasury and the whole pensions and growth agenda? How would you summarise where that's got to and our assessment of the state of play there?
Thanks, James. Thank you, everybody, for joining us. We've got some time for Q&A on any of these issues as well, so please do feel free to ask me about anything on this list or not on this list. There are quite a few things that, just for completeness, are not on this list. Things like the pension protection levy, bits of guidance and consultation that we know are coming, but that might have led to quite a lot of slides. So coming back to the kind of main point, James, I think the pensions and growth agenda continues to be a very big priority for this government. We saw that through the year from a lot of the consultations in the summer associated with the Mansion House speech, and then the autumn statement, which continued the theme with some of the responses and next steps, which I'll come on to in a minute. There were 110 growth measures that were announced in the autumn statement. quite a few which are associated with a kind of knock-on impact to pension schemes with direct consultations or maybe indirect things like the growth of the kind of role of the British Business Bank, the ask of them to kind of create a growth fund for institutional investors to buy into, to invest into sectors where the UK could be doing better or could do more growth capital. So I think there's been a lot of that dynamic, and I think as we'll come on to with Katy, that dynamic is likely to continue even if we have an election during the year or at the beginning of next year and a change in government. It seems to be a kind of cross-party issue, and so there's a lot to engage in that space. If I look at some of the other items on this list, there's a huge amount that's going on in kind of DC agenda for the moment. In particular, I think this kind of push towards combinations of consolidation, value for money, and productive finance all blend together in lots of different ways. We clearly have the consultation open at the moment on small pots, with the question about kind of what happens with a pot for life provider, very much kind of green scoping from government, but it's certainly something that they're very enthusiastic about. And I think that kind of Q1 question about where does that direction of travel go, what does that kind of call for evidence lead us to, and how does that shape the future of AE? These are enormous questions, so lots to think about there. There is a lot of work that we're taking part on with the FCA on value for money. I think we'll see that consultation in Q1 too, and that will obviously shape the direction of consolidation, certainly in the smaller part of the market where they're clearly looking to try and nudge certain parts out of the market and to encourage a different way of looking at things. So I think some really interesting big themes in the DC space next year, and in particular, a lot of them are very interconnected. So it's quite hard at the moment to fully understand the combinations of the strategy and also how they might work with one another to change the way that pension schemes operate, change the way that the kind of market operates more widely. So a lot in that space to be thinking about.
Yeah. It's a very busy agenda, isn't it, Joe? And as you say, a lot of those DC items sort of fit together and also link into the sort of pensions and growth agenda. What about the DB side, Joe? What do you see as the key things for people to watch out for next year?
Yes, on the DB side, we've obviously been waiting for quite a long time for the final DB funding code. The latest expectation is that the regulations from DBP that enable the code and kind of activate it will be made in the spring and kind of mainly come into force with the code in the autumn for valuations beyond that point to be caught by the code. Now, obviously, we're expecting to see extra flexibility in some of the changes that we've called for to be made in the code. And I think that's a really positive step. It definitely shows that the regulator has been listening. And obviously during the course of the start of this, which was very much at the beginning of the pandemic, and to the point we are now, there's been a very dramatic change in schemes funding positions overall. So the approach does really need to change. And I think more widely, the attitude from government in terms of kind of risk-taking and supporting ongoing provision has altered quite a lot too. So I think we'll probably see some really positive changes in the DB funding and code, and hopefully a recognition of a lot of those factors. There's also the expected consultations on surplus release, which were announced in the autumn statement, and also this winter consultation on the PPF as a consolidator too. So two quite big things, and how all of these interact with each other will also be really important. And kind of what kind of behaviours do they drive from employers, from schemes, and how will members perceive some of them as well? You know, what happens with the question of surplus? Big questions there too.
Thanks, Joe. It's quite encouraging to hear your kind of upbeat vibe about the DB funding code, and it sounds like we've managed to sort of get some extra flexibilities there, and presumably not just for open schemes. I know we've been lobbying on that, and that's a subset of our membership, but perhaps more widely as well.
Yes, I think more widely as well, we should see some changes that we've been asking for, and I think that that kind of engagement with the regulator over kind of several years now has worked really well. They do seem to be listening and adjusting. Until we see the final bits of documentation, still have to kind of keep at it and keep your fingers crossed. But I'm positive about the direction of travel.
Great. Joe, I'm going to put some questions from the audience to you in a couple of minutes, and I can see one or two start to come in. So do type questions in there, folks. But let's just come on to local government pension scheme, Joe. I mean, lots going on there too, lots of there in the autumn statement. What are the key things you would pick out on the LGPS front?
Thanks, James. So on the deluxe side, I think we've continued to have a period of pretty much instability. There's been 14 deluxe ministers over the last 6 or 7 years. So I think that has led to a degree of stasis on some things. There's certainly 2 or 3 years worth of consultations pretty much backed up at deluxe for various reasons. They are prioritising the follow-up to the consultation in the summer on combinations of governance, what's the future of pooling, what's the future of the transition of funds to the pools over that 2025 period, and what's the complier explain regime going to look like. So Q1 is the expected timetable for that consultation, which I think is a pretty fundamental consultation on the future shape of the LGPS and what happens. So that's something that we're going to engage with very heavily. There are other things, especially the good governance report, which has got a lot of recommendations that need to be taken forward. There are other elements like fair pay and other things, and including TCFD, which is long overdue from DLUC in terms of the kind of final sets of guidance. We might see that at the back end of the year, or maybe even tip into next year, which is delayed, but plenty going on there. Yeah,
plenty there. But I know you and the team, Tiffany's team, we're doing a lot of work for our LA members there. Let's click on to the next slide, because I know, Joe, you've got some more items listed that we need to look out for. Some of these are sort of cross-cutting items. What are your sort of highlight ones there that you think are particularly will have a particular impact?
Yeah, so I think we'll see the trustee register come through from TPR at some point. Clearly, I think that's a real positive. It's something that we supported in response to the call for evidence, that there is a lot more in that space that can be done. We'll see more on the UK green taxonomy and more updates on TNFD come through the year, which will be important for schemes to kind of keep on top of. And obviously, as investors, you want that clarity on the green taxonomy, how metrics might play out, how they'll be improved, what kind of reporting companies will be needing to be doing. So that will come through. I think that'll be fairly comprehensive. We'll probably see a lot of activity, but a couple of years probably to embed it. Dashboards, the reset continues. And I think the messages from the regulators and elsewhere is continue to do your prep. But I think from an industry perspective, we need to see a lot more clarity, but it will have a big impact when that comes through. These other areas, including the general code, which I saw a question pop up on. General code is pretty much done. What TPR is waiting for is some time in Parliament, which has to delay, I think, 40 days. So once that time is granted, the code will be there and kind of will be in place not so long after that. And these other areas where we see guidance. On the FCA side, there's a lot of activity going on, connected a little bit to the autumn statement and a kind of wider push for productivity and investment and growth to do a review of primary markets to make the UK as competitive as it can be. There are questions there for us, I think, as investors and asset owners about, is good governance being lost in some of that process? So we'll be engaging in that. And obviously, the VFM thing will be very important. And advice guidance, a thorny issue that's been around for many, many years. We are expecting imminent consultation or the discussion papers on that. So please watch out for that. That'll be coming very soon. And clearly, that big caveat at the bottom, we might have a general election. So when that falls will really determine how much progress can be made on many of these issues. So we'll be kind of straddling a couple of horses at once, I think, because some things will progress, some things are cross-party, some things are very dependent on the priorities of the government of the day.
Yeah, yeah. Well, I think we will have an election, won't we? Unless it gets delayed until January 25. I think it's technically possible, but feels very unlikely to me. But Katie, you can perhaps comment later. So thanks, Joe. That's a great survey of this massive stuff that's going on. And I think you've already picked up, thank you, Becky McDermott's point in the chat about the general code. You said it's sort of pretty well done. So hopefully, Becky, that covers your point. Do say if it doesn't. Joe, we've got some Q&A coming in. Let's start with one from David Lane from TPT. David asked, do you anticipate TPR actively pursuing or driving consolidation of the existing DC master trusts? Interesting one.
I think they'll unlikely to drive it in. They don't have a lever to drive it in a particular way at the moment until they have some of the levers around value for money and also decumulation, where they kind of intimated they would like all master trusts to be able to provide a whole of life journey and solution. And there have been elements around CDC for that in the latest call for evidence. So I think they don't have a direct means to make that happen. I think from all the signaling, from whether it's kind of combinations of blogs, statements, speeches, there is an appetite to see consolidation in the market, and they will work towards it as an objective. There is a different question about whether that's within their strategic priorities or legislative priorities or legislative permissions, but that is the direction of travel. And I think you'll see that general push across the market to try and consolidate and to get scale.
Yeah. Okay. And we've got a pretty broad question from Craig Rimmer. Craig asked, for new pensions minister, Paul Maynard MP, is known to be more of a free marketeer. Do we feel he'll be able to reverse some of the more interventionist government agenda in pensions? I don't know. What is it too early, Joe, to assess Mr. Maynard's, leanings and direction?
I might chip in on this one, actually.
Please do, Nigel.
Because Julian and I had a meeting with him a couple of weeks ago.
Yeah.
And I don't know about reversing Craig, but my impression was that he was kind of going to he's going to be his own man, as we used to say. He's going to make up his own mind when he sees the responses to the consultations. I rather felt he was pretty keen on making sure people had a decent pension, especially people on lower incomes. And he certainly seemed to be open-minded about the Pop for Life consultation and would sort of judge it on the evidence and the facts. Yeah. So maybe that's halfway towards what Craig's thinking. Obviously, it's quite late in the Parliament for any dramatic change.
Do you think, Nigel, that he'll have that much room for manoeuvre? I mean, the Treasury drives a lot of the big decisions. You say it's kind of late in the Parliament. Is he going to be able to make that much of an impact himself?
Well, obviously, there's no pensions bill, so that's going to deeply limit his ability to make dramatic change. But there is a whole bunch of sort of policy work and consultations that he could push forward on.
Yeah.
Some of the things Joe was outlining.
Yeah.
I don't think. I think it's more a question of, can some things be speeded up and some things slowed down at this stage? It does feel like they presumably got less than a year to go. So.
Yeah. Okay. Very helpful, Nigel. Thank you. Let's pick up another question. Probably all one for Joe. I think Sarah Dickinson asked about dashboards, which you just touched on, Joe. But she says dashboards deadline to connect is 31st of October 2026. But will there be individual scheme connection dates within guidance during the spring? And how mandatory are the individual connection dates? Joe, what can you say about all that?
I think there are unlikely to be individual connection dates given the number of schemes and the number of schemes that connect. But I think what's likely to be there is an encouragement for the largest, most schemes with the most members to be ready, and there'll probably be extra intervention from the regulators to kind of check in to make sure you're ready. They are doing behind the scenes quite a lot of work with administrators to check out how ready people are, what progress is being made in a sort of quasi-engagement way. But I think probably not. I think there probably is also an open question about some of the timing. Fortunately for the government, the implementation date dips beyond and into the next Parliament. So we're still waiting on all that reset information. So if that happens to get caught up in any way, we may see further changes. But all the mood music is please be ready, do as much as you can, bear with us, we'll get the guidance to you as soon as possible. That does create some crunch points for schemes, for administrators, and for all sorts of other providers, which really do need to be dealt with as soon as humanly possible in order to make 2026 achievable, even with a lot of hard work. So I think it's still a little bit of flux, but I would imagine there won't be specific dates.
Yeah, James,
Okay.
I'm just going to add to that. All I'm hearing so far from Labour is indeed that they like the idea of dashboards and they want to get on with it. Now, when they get much deeper and closer to it, they may revise that view. But at the moment, it looks like it's carry on, please. So what Joe's saying there about take the timeline seriously and have no regrets feels like the right thing.
Okay, thanks, Nigel. We've got one or two more questions we'll come back to later, I expect. But Nigel, I just want to sort of put you back in the hot seat to talk a little bit about what the PLSA is going to be focusing on, your team, in terms of the issues we'll make a priority for our policy work over the next 12 months. And I think you had a meeting with a policy board yesterday. So what can you tell us about the outcome of that? I think you've got a slide there.
Yeah, we did have a discussion on next year's work programme, and we'll do a sort of formal press release about this, an explanation probably in January. But just between ourselves and the people on the call, the policy board basically endorsed our plans for next year, and in particular, sort of two strategic projects, where we're given a particular priority and a particularly proactive. So one is leaning into the whole ongoing pensions and growth debate, because again, not only the government but also Labour, they're all very, very keen on seeing whether pensions can be used to somehow boost UK growth. They seem a little bit slow on the uptake of realising if they increased AE contributions, they'd have more money in equities and some of that would go to the UK, but we keep making that point. And we've got sort of 6 tracks of work under the pensions and growth work, getting the right assets and the right pipeline of assets, getting the right fiscal incentives, making the AE market for DC schemes focus more on performance than cost, flexibility in DB regulation, and the right kind of consolidation. Plus, as I said, AE contribution. So that's a big one. And then the other big thing is that because it is general election year, we think it makes sense to pull together our greatest hits from the last few years and kind of put in a simple document our kind of vision for pensions 2035. Now, with our members, we've done work about how we think things should go. For instance, in the 5 Steps to Better Pensions report, in the Hitting the Target report, in the DB Task Force report. We'll pull all those together, but we'll also update them to take account of the latest developments, particularly on the debate around small pots and consolidation. But there are also other factors like ESG, which has become more central. So those 2 big things. And then it's all our old faves. Better DC, so that's partly about adequacy, that's partly about value for money, responding to DC decumulation stuff. We've been pushing our guided retirement income choices approach. The good news is that the current government and indeed Labour, in case they get elected next year, they all seem pretty interested in having some kind of defaulting type regime to help people at retirement. There's a small pots thing I've mentioned, so DC. There's the future DB. There's, again, a lot of stuff Joe's talked about. So flexibility in the TPR regulations, dealing with this whole issue about will there be a PPF consolidator? How should surpluses be treated? Will we get a statutory regime at some point for super funds? So all about options for DB schemes. Working with the LGPS, helping forge and influence the LGPS of the future. There's a lot of change being imposed upon them at the moment. We want to step into that. All the responsible investment stuff, all the engagement stuff, dashboards like we just talked about, as Joe was mentioning, advice guidance boundary. And finally, the quality of governance and admin. So trustee skills has come back onto the agenda again, which is a good thing. But there's also probably going to be looking at some other aspects of that, such as DE&I aspects. So, plenty to keep us busy next year.
It is a very busy agenda, Nigel, and we've got a minute or two to put one or two more questions to Nigel or Joe before we come on to Katy and talk a little bit more about the politics. I can see there's one there from Ronnie Morgan. Maybe it's more for Joe, I think. Ronnie asks, any concern that the FCA might press ahead with their value for money framework ahead of TPR stroke trust, given there's no bill, no pensions bill, but will be a consultation from the FCA? Quite sure I follow Ronnie's line there. What's the impact on each if that happens? Joe, do you want to sort of disentangle that and explain what you think the timeline is on the value for money work?
Thanks, James. Yes, happy to try and disentangle. So to date, DWP and TPR have been working closely in tandem to develop the value for money framework. When they've consulted, it's been a sort of joint consultation, obviously with some quite often with multiple forwards from different ministers or different chief execs in various quarters. Because of the lack of a pensions bill in the King's Speech, it doesn't really give DWP the same kind of locus to continue their work or to do it in a kind of formal way, that the way that the FCA can write rules. We are expecting an FCA consultation in the spring. We're feeding into some of the work that's going on to build to that consultation. But I do think and recognise there is a risk that the FCA may run ahead in terms of its work and its progress. They are working still very closely with the DWP teams. But the thing you always worry about is if the FCA gets it into some rules ahead of DWP getting anything into some regulations and associated guidance, that you either have a disparity or you end up with what tends to happen is an FCA regime is a little bit tighter, a little bit more gold-plated, and doesn't really reflect the way that the trust-based world works in its truest sense. They've gotten better at that, but it does run that risk. So we're engaging with them. We're obviously being very mindful to kind of make sure that you don't have that disparity emerge across the sector. There is still quite a lot of time for it to run through. So even if we have a consultation in the spring, there'll be 12 weeks. That'll take us to summer recess. Then we're into the autumn. We might have an autumn election. So there's quite a lot of moving parts to think about, but we have to be conscious of those risks and engage with them throughout to go and mitigate them and get good outcomes.
Good stuff. Reassuring. Thanks, Joe. And we've got one more question. I think it's probably again for you, Joe. I'm not sure I completely follow the question, but Michael Burton is asking, is the PLSA going to be updating its skills and knowledge matrix for trustees and managers in the coming year? I'm not quite exactly sure what Michael's referring to there by way of a matrix.
So it's possible that you mean it could be combinations of either trusteeship, or it could be where we've had trustee training, or it could be where we've had guidance.
Michael, if maybe you can just Michael give us another comment, just exactly what it is he's after there. Obviously, we do our trustee training courses, and we put a lot of information and briefing and info out for trustees and managers. So just give us a bit more specificity there, Michael. And in the meantime, I'm going to he's come straight back in actually. So before I go to Katy, Michael says I can clarify there is guidance on what knowledge and understanding trustees need. We measure against each year. Isn't this for TPR, TKU framework though? It sounds to me like that's what Michael's referring to, Joe.
If it is the TKU rather than something from the PLSA, then it's possible that TPR will update it, but I think it looks to me that they've got a lot of other priorities on their plate, and they're going to prioritize some of the other things first. But happy, Michael, if you want to drop me an email outside of the webinar, then I'm very happy to kind of pick up and pick up more detail.
Very helpful. Thanks, Joe. Great. Well, let's turn to Katy to talk a bit more about the sort of political situations. Katy deals very much with the politicians and make sure we're well connected with them. So, Katy, I think we are going to have an election next year, unless you tell me otherwise. What about? Let's start with the Conservatives. You know, how do you see their priorities pension wise in the general election?
Yeah, So for the Conservatives, I would say that their manifesto process is usually one that is quite highly centralised and usually kept behind locked doors at CCHQ. However, I think we can take a pretty good guess on what sort of pensions-related content is going to appear, both from interactions we've had with ministers and also drawing on some of the current work streams that are ongoing at DWP and also HMT. So on investment, I know we've already mentioned this, but the Chancellor's Mansion House reforms and also the recent autumn statement announcements really highlight the role that this government sees in pensions playing in the growth agenda. And I think given that, it's very, very likely to see that narrative to continue. And I would expect it to feature quite prominently in the Conservative manifesto. And I would, just to emphasise that the economy is very much a focal point at the moment in current political discourse. I think it's also likely that the Conservatives will push for things like further consolidation on pensions and perhaps also outline measures to further enhance competitiveness. So we've seen things like the LIFTS initiative emerge. We've also seen at the autumn statement that the government is going to look forward to carry forward some of its capital markets work as well. On pensions more specifically, we know that the government support things like the development of CDC, and I think they probably bring forward plans to continue with multi-employer and also commercial offerings, and again, pushing forward some of the work on things like small pots, value for money, and also delivering on dashboards. On the state pension, interestingly, I think there are emerging reports that the next manifesto will not contain a commitment to retain the triple lock. And I think, again, over the last couple of years, inflation has really driven up the uprating figures. So although we as the PLSA were very, very happy to see that it was retained at the autumn statement, I think there's some questions about costs there that are being very seriously considered. And then, going forward, I think the government has also been warming to bringing forward policies on reforming things like automatic enrolment. We had the government support that private members bill earlier this year on the extension of AE to bring in workers that are 18 years old and also to ensure pension saving from the first pound of earning. But we do know that the previous pensions minister, Laura Trott, was also very keen on this idea of stapling, and we've got the Pot for Life proposals ongoing at the moment. So it might be interesting to see whether the manifesto sets out what might happen in that space with a bit more detail going forward as well.
Yeah, thanks, Katie. And just before we move on to talk about Labour, you mentioned there the automatic enrolment changes which the government is endorsing. And Ming Fong, I see in the Q&A, is asking about that, and it maybe Katie, it's one for you or perhaps for Joe. Do we have any sense of when we might have more detail on when the upcoming auto enrolment changes will come in, i.e. the change to age 18, removing the lower earnings limit, and impact on the certification sets?
I think the government has said that they will consult on implementing those changes, and they will also need some secondary legislation to bring it forward. So I think depending on how likely, when the next election might be, will depend on whether they're able to bring forward those changes, perhaps this year, or if not, it will be looking sort of slightly later on as well.
Okay, thanks. That's really helpful. And what about the Labour Party, Katie? I mean, odds on to win the next election at the moment, anyway. It's certainly looking that way. How do you see their priorities? What are they going to be talking about pension-wise in the election?
So earlier this year, the Labour National Policy Forum set out and actually consulted on 6 priorities. And the National Policy Forum for Labour is really a key policy-making body. So I would expect those 6 priorities to link in very closely with the upcoming manifesto offering. And just to recap, those priorities were delivering growth, the everyday economy, empowered communities, prevention, early intervention, and better public services for all, supporting families, and a progressive trade policy. So what does this mean for pensions? I think that we know from speeches that the Shadow Chancellor has given, Rachel Reeves, she's made this commitment for Labour to achieve the highest growth in the G7 within 1 year of coming into power. And as we've mentioned, very, very similarly to the Conservatives, we know that those shadow teams see a much bigger role for pensions in helping to contribute to that. And Labour are actually currently at the moment carrying out a financial services review, and this is all focused upon how that will be achieved. I think the Shadow Chancellor has also said that she wants to see more of the money saved for retirement to find its way into expanding UK businesses. Rachel Reeves is also publicly committed to the idea of things like a growth fund and reforming the UK pension system. And then post-autumn statement as well, the Shadow Chancellor made promises to go further on things like consolidation and also the green agenda. Beyond sort of the growth narrative, Labour's also promised to reform the employment landscape. So in a speech to the TUC, the Deputy Leader, Angela Rayner, gave a cast iron commitment to bring forward an employment rights bill. So I think the vision within this was to ban things like 0-hour contracts and reform employment status. So we might see more people being brought into the scope of AE. And then more just generally picking up the conversations we've had with Labour, I think they're quite keen on the idea of CDC also. We've also spoken to them around the potential of increasing contributions. We know this is something they're sympathetic to, but I don't think it's going to be explicitly called out within their manifesto commitments. I think it's more likely that they're going to want to leave a little bit of room to manoeuvre around issues like that. And again, just touching on dashboards as well, we know that previously Labour has supported a non-commercial single pensions dashboard. So we might see a little bit of shake up in the programme, depending when they get in and how they feel about it.
Well, thanks, Katie. That's a very comprehensive rundown on what Labour are planning. And obviously, you and Nigel and Joe and the team spent a lot of time talking to Whitehall officials and ministers. How would you sort of describe our links and connections with the Labour side of things?
Yeah, I mean, we've been doing an awful lot this year to really try and bolster the conversations we're having with some of those key political figures. So, for example, we hosted a summer parliamentary reception in which we outlined some of our key priorities and initiative and spoke to politicians about it. We've also fed into a number of roundtables. I know Nigel went to a Labour roundtable yesterday. And we've also fed into that Labour Financial Services review as well that I mentioned as well. So we've got lots going on.
Yeah, that's good. It's good to have those connections, essential, obviously. And so the parties are going to publish manifestos. We would love to see all our PLSA ideas in there. Nigel briefly said, or Joe briefly said, we're going to do a sort of pensions for 2025 paper. Is that going to be our kind of main vehicle for trying to influence the content of the manifestos?
Pensions
Nigel, we'll let you come in.
2035. Sorry, Katie. Sorry. I don't think it will be our main vehicle, actually, James, because we'll be doing multiple channels. The idea is to have something to hand over to a new government. We've been, as Katie was probably about to say, we've been feeding in loads of material for, certainly intensively over the last year. So there are many different ways of getting through to people, but maybe I'll hand over to Katie.
Yeah, so absolutely. We'll be obviously setting out that vision, as Nigel said. We're also going to be taking things forward like the Better Pensions Charter. So at annual conference, people may have realised that we launched a Better Pensions Charter, and its aim was really to show to policymakers and the people writing those manifestos that there is a lot of consensus that exists amongst the industry about how the future of AE should be reformed to help people have better incomes in retirement. And we worked with a lot of our stakeholders to get them to essentially jointly sign up to this charter. And going forward into the new year, we're hopefully going to be talking to employers about how we can bring some of those people on board as well.
Brilliant. Okay, Katie, thanks very much. I'm just scanning the Q&A box and I'm not seeing any more questions coming in, and we are nearly at time. So unless anyone types one in very quickly in the next 30 seconds, I'm going to sort of draw proceedings towards a close. As we always do, we'll circulate the slides and the recording of this to everyone who's registered, and the recording will be on our website as well, so you can sort of catch up with it and watch it again if you want, or your colleagues and friends might want to. I'm sure there'll be a feedback form, because there's always a feedback form after any kind of PLSA event. Do please put your comments on that. We really do look at them and it's really helpful to us. And Nigel and I are having a chat at the moment about our webinar program and plans for next year. So if there's particular topics you want to see featured, do let us know. And Joe's just typed in, thank you, Joe. Yes, you've got any more follow-up questions on anything we've been discussing, then drop us a line. You can send that through to me or to Joe as you wish. I should give a mention for our next big large-scale in-person PLSA event, which is coming up alarmingly soon, the investment conference in Edinburgh at the end of February, 27th to the 29th of February. Registration is open for that, and I can see we've got some good speakers lined up. Linda Grattan, I saw. We've got Paul Johnson from the IFS, I believe, who's always great. So looking forward to that, and it would be great to see plenty of you there. Otherwise, I'm going to thank Nigel and Joe and Katie very much for all their work in preparing this and for their contributions. I'm going to wish everyone who's dialed in happy Christmas when it comes, and enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you.